yourself to females in such a way that smushing follows soon thereafter. Smushing is copulating, for those also not in the know. Simply put, to live is to creep and vice versa. So, I mean, situation knows what he wants in life and takes explicit strategic action so as to maximize that potential. As for the use of the word Guido, the show has gotten a lot of attention because of this. The Italian-American community considers this a sort of racialist or negative charged term. However, the cast members of the Jersey Shore really embrace it as a point of like sort of friendly identity. They don't mean it in terms of hostility or derogatory tone, but they rather ascribe it to themselves and to their friends. As for the use of the word Guido, it's about celebrating a unique lifestyle, a lifestyle that embraces a certain look and attitude, and the philosophy of GTL, crushing it, which just pretty much means being awesome 24/7. Paulie B, I was born and raised in Guido. It's just a lifestyle. It's being Italian. It's representing family, friends, tanning, gel, everything, which I think, again, invites social scientist sort of perspectives into the Jersey Shore. It says, look, if you want to understand the behaviors that you're observing, you need to know something about the local community and how it is that they perceive value on their own terms. So, Guido coordination problems happen on the Jersey Shore. You take a couple hundred juice heads, give them tons of alcohol and energy drinks, and set them loose in a club with hundreds of chicks who are DTF, down to what's going to happen? Fist pumping, swishing, and definitely some fighting. So one of the first puzzles would be, well, this show is filled with violent interaction. People fight regularly. But that's not to say that there aren't social science patterns that seem to present themselves in the course of the show. Now, this is pretty straight social science. We have relatively anonymous agents. They know one another in the house, but in season 1, for example, they don't. The house members don't necessarily know all of the people at the overpopulated Jersey Shore. They are openly materialistic and egotistical, right? They're very sort of self-assured, which has been used explicitly as one of the motivating assumptions of game theory, for example, that if you can resolve coordination problems with what are called perfect egoists, individuals who have no sense of empathy or sympathy or other regarding behavior, but are purely motivated for their own self-interest. If you could solve coordination problems amongst the most hostile of agents, then that's truly a test to the robustness of the social norms and the functionality thereof to promote social order. Not only that, but they are explicitly strategic, as we saw in the previous slide, but they're also intoxicated. And lastly, they're all on vacation. So they're not permanent members of this community necessarily, but they're also thrown amidst lots of other people who are also on vacation and in conditions of relative anonymity to one another. Which is to say that their behaviors are one-shot games and not necessarily they don't have the opportunity to recognize the long-run returns of social cooperation, of building reputations, and cooperating with one another long enough in the long run. So again, this is something, or these conditions are sort of ripe for the GMU way of thinking. A lot of the research that has come out of this program in recent years has investigated things like social order amongst pirate ships, social order amongst prison inmates, other books and investigatory studies exist that investigate social order as it exists amongst primates, arguably the most applicable framework for the Jersey Shore. And in each of these conditions, it appears that the potentials for social cooperation and divisions of labor, social hierarchies, specialization of tasks, and entrepreneurial innovations tend to shine through, even without formal constructivist designed rules and legislations. In other words, despite the fact that there is no, regardless of what the situation might want you to believe, there is no head of the household, there is no explicit rulemaker to govern all of Jersey Shore debauchery, yet certain levels of functional cooperation do exist. Now again, the show is sort of smattered with violence, but to a large extent, we should be puzzled that any degree of cooperation or social harmony exists at all. These conditions are ripe for sort of total debaucherous chaos. And yet, fighting is relatively intermittent, and furthermore, there is an explicit culture of a distaste for violence. Even though it appears very in contrast to what you see in the show, any of the characters will explain that they go out and they conduct themselves with an intentional effort to avoid violent confrontation with other people. And arguably, other than the cast members fighting amongst one another, when such violent interactions do occur on the show, it's never instigated by the cast members of the show with regard to other people. It's usually predominantly defensive and instigated by observers and people outside of the show. So what aspects of social theory and behavioral social science can we witness or observe in the episodes of the Jersey Shore? First and foremost is what you could call in-group, out-group dynamics. In the first season, and one of the major sort of advertising moments for MTV of getting attention for the show is this sort of terrible instance when all of the cast goes to a bar and some guys are sort of drinking shots that they order in hopes of getting free drinks. And Snooki, whose real name is Nicole, is calling them out on this, saying, hey, those aren't yours. Why are you taking our drinks? That's inappropriate. And the guy punches her in the face. And this has sort of been like a big to-do. They cut the clip out of the episode because it's very abrasive to watch, and ended up raising a lot of awareness with regard to violence against women and so on and so forth. But interestingly enough, if you had watched the episodes before that show, Snooki was sort of isolated from the rest of the household. She, on the first episode, had way too much to drink and ended up puking all over everybody. And everybody in the house was just like, oh, this drunken girl is going to ruin our good time. And they were sort of ostracizing her and not including her in the friendship that was forming amongst the rest of the housemates. And she noticed this and was depressed about it and very upset. Once someone from outside of the house punched her in the face, it grew an entire sense of cohesion amongst the members in the house. We see similar coordination problems resolved at the national level with exogenous threats of military violence. For example, the degree of cohesive policymaking that took place so as to promote the Patriot Act after 9/11 is basically a very similar parallel to this process. Secondly, heterogeneous gender roles. This one's kind of funny. If you don't watch the show, the girls on the show tend to fight a lot more with one another than the men. And admittedly, the men sort of have an easier time doing what would be called like assembly line production functions. They can cook and clean really fast and efficiently relative to the collective group of the women. And there are distinctive groups. It's like the boys and the girls. It's very dichotomous in that sense. And a friend of mine was fascinated by this and asked me and said, why is it, and she herself felt sort of offended insofar as it's such a degrading presentation of women on this show because they act so ridiculously. Again, sort of unwilling to step inside and think about the rational choice motivations of these agents. And I couldn't help, I was reading, there's this great book called Peacemaking Amongst Primates, which is about ape species, written by a guy named van der Waal, which also describes this very sort of dichotomous ability
for groups of men versus women apes to resolve social conflict. To some extent, amongst ape species, men are more sort of prone to the marginal instance of violent interaction, which gives them a process of engaging in peacemaking and apology rituals, and refines that norm and procedure. Whereas the sort of women cluster in these ape species tend to be